All the way from the start, I can feel it in my heart, like all the way from the start.
Hey, what's going on out there? I'm Sean Devine. Hope you all are doing well. Today we're going to talk about mastering hip hop. This is something that I get a lot of questions on, and so I figured we would just dive into the process. I'm going to walk you through a lot of the steps that I'm taking to master tracks, and we're going to use one plugin, which is iZotope's Ozone 7. It's a great plugin if you're looking for something that has all the tools that you need to do a proper professional master. Very useful, and it sounds great. So I'm going to go ahead and just play back a little bit of our mix here, and then we'll talk about it and jump into mastering this song from scratch.
From all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ. And my mama fell down, everything changed. Doctor said she probably wouldn't see another day.
All right, so that gives you an idea of what we're dealing with in our mix. One thing I want to point out that I get a lot of questions on is what is the preferred format for your mixed wave file to be in for mastering. I prefer to use 44K 24-bit. Some engineers like to use a higher sample rate like 48K or even 96K, and that's fine. It's certainly not going to hurt. However, my philosophy is that ultimately it's going to be released at 44.1 eventually. So I would rather just go ahead and be at this point, and 24-bit is just my preference, working at a little higher bit rate. If you have a 44K 16-bit wave, you're going to have what you need to get things done in the mastering process. The other thing I want to point out is that I have a little bit of headroom in our mixed wave file. Now, when I'm doing the mastering in the same session as the mix, I generally like to mix into my mastering chain, which is usually just a limiter. So I'm not as concerned about pushing levels in that sense. But here, when we're doing the mastering separately, you want to allow a little bit of headroom so that we can do what we need to do in this process specifically. So we got some stuff out of the way here. Let's jump into the fun part. We're going to go ahead and just master this thing. And I'm going to put Ozone 7 onto our stereo output. And I'm using the standard version of Ozone 7 here. And you'll notice that it pulls up a couple of default modules. We're just going to get rid of all of those and start from scratch and build our own custom mastering chain. The first thing that I want to add, which is actually going to be the last thing in our chain, I just want to go ahead and put it on here, and I'll tell you why, is we're going to add the maximizer. And what this is going to do, at least for the time being, is just keep us from clipping and keep our levels in check. We're going to adjust the threshold later so that we bring the levels up to commercial volume. But for right now, this is really just kind of a safety net to keep us from clipping or really pushing things too hard with the other modules. So all we want to do is first select the proper IRC. The IRC in Ozone is the intelligent release control, and it just basically is the algorithm that kind of decides the sound of the maximizer and the limiter. And some of them are more, I would say, punchy and more transparent than others. And so it's just a matter of taste where you want to put this. But I personally prefer the newest IRC, IRC4, and I like to leave it on modern. It's pretty transparent, and I like the way it treats the transients and the dynamics. So we'll leave that here for now. And then on our threshold, I'm going to leave that at 0, and we're going to put the ceiling at -0.1 just to keep it just below 0. And I'm going to turn on true peak limiting. So what this is, don't get too confused about this, but basically it just takes into account the digital to analog conversion. The analog world, there's a little bit different measurement for clipping, and so this takes it into account, and it's just a little bit safer setting to make sure that we're not going above absolute 0. So we're going to leave that on, and then we're going to leave our character and the transient emphasis, those controls. We're not going to touch those right now, but we will later in the master. Next thing we're going to add is the vintage limiter, and I'm just going to slide this over to be before the maximizer, and we're going to be using this in tandem with the limiter from the maximizer section. So we're not relying on this to be our brick wall limiter. This is more of a stylistic thing, the purpose being to kind of simulate an analog console that's going to give the master a little bit of warmth, a little bit of saturation. So I'm going to switch the mode to analog. I'm going to leave the threshold at -2 because, again, we're not trying to get a lot of level out of this. It's just a style thing. I'm going to leave the ceiling at 0, and we'll turn the character more towards fast. And what this is going to do is we're going to be able to retain the transients and maintain the punchiness and the dynamics, versus slow is going to give you a little bit more of a glued type of sound with the limiter. But again, we're not pushing the limiter that hard, so this shouldn't affect the transients much. But let's just go ahead and play that back.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves.
So it's giving us a little bit of level, but more importantly, a bit of the analog saturation, the sound that I'm going for with this module. So let's go ahead and move on, and we're going to add a dynamic EQ, and we'll move that just after the vintage limiter. Now, I do want to talk about this. You know, a lot of these EQs and compressors and things you can get carried away with in the mastering stage. My personal philosophy is I don't want to rely on these tools to be really adding a lot of frequencies or, you know, boosting things too heavily. I want to focus on the mix and really get it to where it needs to be there. And then once we get to the master, we're just kind of kissing things, gluing things, and making sure that we're adding the icing on the cake, if you will. But in terms of how we're going to use the dynamic EQ for this mix, we're just going to use it to glue the kick and the bass in the low end, just to make it nice and smooth. A lot of you out there have trouble kind of getting the smooth low end, and this will definitely help you. So we're going to be using the first band, and I'm going to move it down here, and we're going to switch it to a band shelf. We'll leave the analog model curve shape. That's fine. And then we're going to adjust the Q so that we're going from about 100 all the way down to like 20 hertz range. Attack and release times, I'm going to leave the attack pretty fast, and then we'll turn the release back just a touch. And then we're going to be adjusting the threshold to the point that this is engaging.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my...
So I'm going to solo this, and you're going to need to listen closely because this is subtle. Again, I'm not using this. I'm not relying on this to control my low end. It's just kissing it a little bit. So let's hear it with.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points.
So if you look at our meters over here, RMS wise, it's applying maybe a dB of reduction. So just a little bit of glue down there. And you can get a little more extreme with it, but I wouldn't recommend it. Again, with something like this tool, this is really to be used subtly. So let's just say we also want to clean up some of our kind of boxy frequencies, 200 to 500, give it a little bit of a smoother sound. I'm just going to create or use this band 3 here, and we'll adjust our Q just a touch. And then we're going to adjust the threshold.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul.
To a little bit slower attack time for this.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ. And my mama fell down, everything changed. Doctor said she probably...
So giving us just a little bit more of a controlled sound there. Now let's go up here to this high band, and I'm going to adjust this just a touch. Let's go ahead and do this Q, and we're just going to go really high up into like 20 hertz and just control some of the extremely high stuff.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ.
So we get a nice little bit warmer sound. We're not trying to roll off a bunch of stuff up here, but just warming it a little bit. This is a better option than just pulling out a straight up EQ and getting crazy, cutting a lot of the frequencies out of our mix. If the mix is done properly, we don't need to do that. So let's go ahead and keep it moving here. And I want to add a post EQ. So going back to, we use the dynamic EQ strictly for reducing and cutting some of our frequencies actively. And we're going to use the post EQ. Again, we don't want anything after the maximizer, so make sure to move that over. But for the post EQ, I'm just going to brighten the entire mix up just a touch. And specifically in this range from about 10K up. This is sort of the band where a lot of the vocal is sitting.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway.
So right at about 10K, this is with.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you.
So we're just adding about a dB and a half there. Very subtle. And next, I want to go ahead and add the imager. Now, this is a really great tool, one of the key tools for mastering, but with stereo imaging, you have to be very careful because the tendency for a lot of people is to do this and just widen every band as much as you possibly can, and it doesn't work.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody.
So we just totally ruined our mix by doing that. It sounds out of phase. It sounds like the whole track is being played through a hallway or something. It just sounds really weird. So don't get too carried away with the imager section. So I'm going to turn all this stuff back to 0 and we'll start from scratch here. The idea with the imaging for me is to take the highs and the high mids and give them just a little bit more spread to make it more exciting. So we're just going to nudge this high end up first.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul.
And if you want to know specifically where you're working with, just turn it all the way down.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after.
And very quickly you can pick up on what it is doing in the sense that you narrow it. Versus now we're going to widen.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day.
So you'll notice that I'm kind of going all the way to the extreme just to hear exactly what we're controlling. And you'll want to do that, and then you want to bring it back.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after.
Now with the low end, you do not want to be directional. You don't want it to be spread out. The sub frequencies, things like that, they should be very narrow. They're going to be played through a sub or a unidirectional speaker. So we want to center those. So I'm going to go and say, whatever a sub would typically cross over to, which is about a 120. And we're just going to narrow that a little bit.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in.
So let's solo our imager section and let's hear what's happening.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice.
So nice little stereo spread we've got going there with the imager. So now to the last step of our mastering. This is where we are going to achieve our level. So you'll notice that we didn't do this initially because we need to get everything else where it needs to be and not be focused on level, because a lot of times this will fool you. If you start adding a bunch of level, you go, oh, it's loud, it's ready to go. That is not the way to think about mastering. This is the last step. So now let's just take a look at where we're at RMS wise. Just for preference purposes, I'm going to also pull out the level meter for Logic and pull up peak and RMS, and we'll just put that over here so we have two references. We also have an RMS reading and a peak reading here on Ozone.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you.
And you'll notice that the measurements are quite different. So that's why I pull up the Logic one. I'm a little more familiar with this and just kind of where it needs to be.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul.
So this is telling us that we're at minus 17. Our target should be somewhere between minus 10 and minus 7 to really compete. So we've got quite a ways to go there. So what we're going to do,
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul.
I'm going to go to our vintage limiter and I'm going to pull the threshold down just a little bit here.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people.
So we'll get a little more level out of that, and then we're going to balance it with some level on our maximizer. So I'm going to start pulling the threshold down.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ. And my mama fell down, everything changed. Doctor said she probably wouldn't see another day. Paralyzed, left side, not mine. Wrong time, I let these hoop dreams die. I'm hanging with the wrong crowd, focus on the foolishness. I need to move through this. Playing on a drum kit 7 hours daily. Bothering my neighbors might have drove my family crazy. I was living like a hooligan.
So I'm just kind of going back and forth between the vintage limiter and the maximizer. And I'm using these in tandem so that we're not, over pushing either one of them. I don't want to try to get too low on the threshold here on the maximizer.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ.
So that feels about right. Now we want to go over here and I'm going to turn our character down and I'll show you what this does. If we go to slow.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people.
You can hear that my snare drum and my kick, they kind of have this more like smushed, squashed, glued sort of sound. This would work better for something like a rock mix, but with urban or dance or anything where you want your drums to be punchy, we're going to be airing more towards this fast character. But let's just slowly go from slow to fast so you can hear what that is doing.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my life, white collar people chasing after bottles. Ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in, even if you got money and you hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway, gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ. And my mama fell down, everything changed.
So at the fast end of things, our drums still have the presence and impact that we had before with just a mix. And that's what we want. We don't want the mastering to destroy our dynamics, and we don't want to rely too much on our maximizer. If you keep an eye on what's being attenuated.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul. When I had to run from all the pain in my...
we're not really squashing it that much. Now, if I turn the threshold down,
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul when I had to run from
boom, mix ruined, master ruined. Just like that, just from pulling that down just a little bit too low.
I've been beating on the drum since day one, feeling music in my soul when I had to run from all the pain in my life. White collar people chasing after bottles, ain't nobody tell you that the problem stay coming in even.
So right there, we can tell that we have a good balance. It's not affecting things. We're not just totally smashing it to get level. And just use your ears. You'll know whenever you've started to pull the threshold too low on your master limiter. So now, just for a demonstration, let's just bypass everything on Ozone. We'll go back to the mix.
I've been beating on the drum since day one.
And let's go to a different section. I know y'all have heard that verse plenty of times now, so we'll switch it.
Hungry for the love of something bigger. I practice ball all day in my parents' driveway. Gloves on, coat zip, 30 points a game like MJ. And my mama fell down, everything changed. Doctor said she probably wouldn't see another day. Paralyzed, left side, not mine. Wrong time, I let these hoop dreams die. I'm hanging with the wrong crowd, focus on the foolishness. I need to move through this.
All right, y'all. So as you can hear, we used Ozone 7 to master this track from scratch, and we did not change the core of the mix, and we didn't affect the transients or the dynamics in a way that are going to make this less impactful. We just did some subtle things that are going to bring it from about 95% to 100% in terms of sound and the quality of the sound that we're trying to get out of it. Didn't get too carried away with the imaging. We used the dynamic EQ or the things like multi-band compression to just do some subtle gluing, nothing too extreme. And then we use the maximizer to get the level. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. If you learned anything in this video, please like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon.
Let these hoop dreams die. I'm hanging with the wrong crowd, focus on the foolishness. I need to move through this. Playing on a drum kit 7 hours daily. Bothering my neighbors might have drove my family crazy. I was living like a hooligan, doing things I never do again. God forgive me, music saved my life. All the way from the start, I can feel it in my heart like